Imagine a civilization so mysterious that historians spent centuries debating whether they were barbaric destroyers or sophisticated administrators, a people whose very name became synonymous with chaos in ancient texts, yet whose archaeological remains tell a completely different story. The Gutians, emerging from the rugged Zagros mountains of western Iran during the late 4th millennium BC, would forever change Mesopotamia, ruling one of humanity's earliest civilizations for over a century, while leaving behind a legacy so controversial that scholars are still rewriting their history today. The towering peaks and deep valleys of the central Zagros Mountains provided the ancestral homeland for these enigmatic highland warriors. Their tribal communities scattered across mountainous terrain that would shape their nomadic lifestyle and extraordinary military prowess for generations to come. Unlike the flat river valleys of Mesopotamia, where cities like Babylon and Ur flourished, the Gutians thrived in an environment that demanded resilience, adaptability, and intimate knowledge of terrain that could either shelter or destroy those unprepared for its challenges. Archaeological investigations at Godin Tepe in the Kangavar Valley have revolutionized our understanding of these early highland societies. Far from the primitive mountain dwellers portrayed in ancient Mesopotamian texts, excavations revealed sophisticated communities dating back to 3500 BC with advanced pottery traditions, standardized ceramic production, and massive storage jars indicating surplus agricultural wealth. Their distinctive grey-black burnished wares with geometric decorations showcased technical mastery, while stone foundations supporting mud brick structures with walls exceeding 1 meter thick demonstrated engineering adapted perfectly to harsh winters and seismic activity. But their greatest advantage was yet to come. The metallurgical revolution unfolding in these mountain valleys would give the Gutians a decisive edge that would terrify Mesopotamian armies for generations. Evidence from Godin Tepe and related sites reveals that Proto-Gutian communities possessed advanced copperworking knowledge by the early 3rd millennium BC. Crucible fragments, slag deposits, and finished tools demonstrate they weren't simply trading for metal weapons, they were manufacturing them locally using techniques refined over centuries. When bronze technology appeared, Gutian smiths quickly mastered it, developing distinctive alloy combinations suited to their available resources. The subsistence economy supporting these highland warriors combined pastoral nomadism with seasonal agriculture in patterns that would define Gutian society throughout their existence. Sheep and goats dominated their herds, perfectly adapted to steep slopes and sparse vegetation where other animals would starve. Wild game supplemented their diet while providing materials for tools and decorative arts that showcased their craftsmanship. Hardy barley crops survived in harsh conditions where wheat would fail. Cultivated using sophisticated terrace systems and irrigation channels that maximized every drop of precious water. But the most perplexing mystery about the Gutians remained their language, a puzzle that has frustrated scholars for over a century. Unlike their contemporaries who spoke well-documented languages like Sumerian or Akkadian, the Gutians left virtually no written records in their own tongue. Personal names like Eridupizir, Imta, and Tirigan, preserved in Mesopotamian texts, show patterns utterly unlike contemporary naming conventions, suggesting a linguistic tradition that was neither Semitic nor Indo-European. Were they survivors of an ancient substrate language that predated the major families that later dominated the region? The answer remains tantalizingly out of reach, but their actions would speak louder than any words. Trade relationships between the highland Gutians and Mesopotamian city-states developed gradually during the late 4th and early 3rd millennia BC, creating connections that would eventually enable conquest. The Zagros Mountains contained treasures highly sought by lowland civilizations, copper ores, precious stones, timber for construction, and organic materials unavailable in Mesopotamia's alluvial plains. Gutian communities controlling access to important mining areas found themselves positioned at the crossroads of ancient commerce, their intimate knowledge of mountain passes and seasonal weather patterns making them indispensable middlemen. Seasonal migration patterns played a crucial role in bringing these two worlds together. Harsh Zagros winters forced pastoral groups toward lower elevations, where temperatures moderated and grazing remained possible. These movements brought Gutian herders into proximity with northern Mesopotamian territories, creating opportunities for both peaceful exchange and future military reconnaissance. Archaeological evidence shows increasing quantities of Mesopotamian manufactured goods, textiles, finished metal objects, luxury items, appearing in highland contexts, while lowland sites yielded more highland products with each passing generation. The social organization of early Gutian communities differed fundamentally from the complex bureaucratic hierarchies of Mesopotamian city-states. Tribal leadership based on kinship relationships and proven military prowess created relatively egalitarian societies where individual achievement mattered more than inherited status. The absence of monumental architecture or large-scale public works contrasted sharply with Mesopotamia's ziggurat temples and irrigation projects. Gutian values emphasized mobility and adaptability over permanence, preparing them perfectly for the lightning campaigns that would soon terrify their southern neighbors. But catastrophe was brewing in Mesopotamia. The collapse of centralized Akkadian authority under Shah Kali-Shari around 2184 BC created a power vacuum that would fundamentally alter the ancient world. The last effective ruler of the Akkadian dynasty had struggled throughout his reign to maintain control over vast territories conquered by his legendary predecessors Sargon and Naram-Sin. His death marked the end of nearly 2 centuries of Akkadian dominance and opened the door for regional powers, including the Gutians, to assert their independence or expand into formerly controlled territories. The economic foundation sustaining the Akkadian Empire showed severe strain in its final decades. Extensive trade networks connecting the Persian Gulf to Anatolia required constant military protection and administrative oversight that became impossible as central authority weakened. Local governors increasingly acted independently, diverting tax revenues and trade profits to their own purposes. Irrigation systems supporting agricultural productivity suffered from neglect as resources flowed toward military campaigns against rebellious provinces. Agricultural production declined, cities emptied, and chaos spread across the land. This economic deterioration created conditions perfectly suited to Gutian expansion strategy. Unlike the Akkadians, who relied heavily on agricultural surpluses from irrigated fields and long-distance trade revenues, the Gutians maintained their traditional pastoral economy, supplemented by raiding and tribute extraction. Their reduced dependence on fixed agricultural infrastructure made them far more resilient to the economic disruptions crippling sedentary Mesopotamian populations. While cities starved and trade routes lay abandoned, Gutian warriors sharpened their weapons. But the age of highland conquest was beginning. Gutian military organization had evolved considerably from tribal raiding parties into a sophisticated force capable of sustained territorial conquest. Archaeological evidence from central Zagros sites suggests communities had begun consolidating under more centralized leadership during the late Akkadian period. This transformation was driven partly by opportunities presented by Mesopotamian weakness and partly by internal pressures as highland populations grew and competition for resources intensified. The warriors descending from the mountains were no longer disorganized bands, but coordinated armies with strategic vision. The transition from highland warfare to lowland conquest required significant tactical adaptations. Traditional fighting methods developed for mountain terrain, where mobility and local geography provided decisive advantages, needed modification for the open plains and urban environments of Mesopotamia. Gutian forces retained their emphasis on rapid movement and surprise attacks, but they also had to develop siege warfare capabilities and techniques for occupying fortified settlements. Evidence from Mesopotamian sites shows destruction layers dated to approximately 2150 BC, followed by architectural modifications and ceramic assemblages showing clear highland influences. The Gutian approach to territorial conquest differed fundamentally from the Akkadian model of imperial administration. Rather than establishing a centralized bureaucratic system with appointed governors and standardized procedures, the Gutians maintained a decentralized approach based on tribute relationships and local accommodation. This strategy proved particularly effective in chaotic post-Akkadian conditions, as it required fewer resources and administrative personnel while still providing access to Mesopotamian wealth. The pattern of expansion reveals strategic priorities focused on controlling key economic and transportation nodes rather than comprehensive occupation. Northern Mesopotamia became their primary target. The geographical pattern of Gutian expansion reveals calculated military intelligence rather than random violence. Northern Mesopotamia, with its proximity to the Zagros Mountains and position along major trade routes connecting Mesopotamia with Anatolia and Iran, became the primary focus. Cities like Ur, Nammu, and various settlements in the Diyala River Valley show clear evidence of Gutian presence. Central Mesopotamia experienced significant penetration too, though the pattern appears more complex. Some settlements were directly occupied, while others maintained nominal independence while paying tribute. The adaptation of Gutian military forces to lowland conditions involved revolutionary changes in equipment and tactics. Highland warfare had traditionally emphasized individual combat skills, mobility, and terrain advantages. Mesopotamian conquest required formation fighting techniques, siege capabilities, and the ability to control and defend fixed positions. Archaeological evidence suggests Gutian forces adopted certain Mesopotamian military technologies, particularly in siege warfare, while maintaining traditional advantages in mobility and guerrilla tactics. Bronze weapons became more common, reflecting both captured equipment and local production. The logistical challenges of maintaining Gutian forces in Mesopotamian territories required creative solutions. The pastoral economy that sustained mountain communities couldn't simply transplant to irrigated plains. Instead, Gutian forces developed hybrid economic strategies combining traditional pastoralism with tribute extraction and participation in lowland agricultural systems. Evidence from occupied sites suggests groups often maintained their herds while also extracting agricultural surpluses from conquered populations. This dual approach provided food security and economic flexibility, allowing forces to remain mobile when necessary while benefiting from Mesopotamia's higher productivity. The Sumerian king list would remember these decades with horror. The Sumerian king list provides the most detailed contemporary account of the Gutian period, though its treatment reflects the perspective of later Mesopotamian scribes rather than neutral observation. According to this source, the Gutians ruled for 91 years and 40 days, with 21 different kings listed by name. The list characterizes the period as one of chaos and barbarism, describing the Gutians as the fanged serpent of the mountains, who carried off the kingship to the mountains. The dramatic language reveals deep trauma, but also propaganda designed to delegitimize highland rule. The relatively short reigns attributed to individual Gutian rulers, often just a few years, suggest a political system quite different from stable Mesopotamian dynasties. This pattern may reflect the tribal nature of Gutian leadership, where authority was more contested and succession less institutionalized than in traditional monarchies. Power was earned through military success and personal charisma rather than inherited automatically, creating a volatile but meritocratic system that kept leaders constantly proving themselves. Other sources provide additional perspectives on the invasion and occupation. The Curse of Akkad, a Sumerian literary composition, attributes the empire's fall to divine punishment for Naram-Sin's destruction of the Ur temple in Nippur. While this text focuses primarily on theological explanations, it also describes the widespread famine, economic disruption, and breakdown of trade relationships that created conditions favorable to Gutian expansion. Various lamentations reflect the trauma experienced by Mesopotamian populations during the transition from Akkadian to Gutian rule, but archaeological evidence tells a different story. Archaeological evidence from sites across northern and central Mesopotamia reveals the complexity of Gutian-Mesopotamian interactions that ancient texts simplified into narratives of pure destruction. At Nippur, excavations have revealed changes in material culture, suggesting foreign influence without complete cultural replacement. New pottery styles appear alongside traditional forms, and architectural modifications show adaptation to different practices while maintaining basic Mesopotamian urban planning principles. This wasn't wholesale destruction, but cultural blending. The site of Eshnunna provides particularly clear evidence for the nature of Gutian occupation. Stratigraphic analysis reveals a destruction period followed by rebuilding with modified architectural styles and new material culture assemblages. The presence of highland pottery forms and metallurgical traditions indicates direct Gutian presence, while the continuation of certain Mesopotamian practices suggests accommodation between conquerors and conquered populations. Similar patterns appear at numerous sites throughout the region, painting a picture far more nuanced than barbaric invasion. The economic impact of Gutian rule extended far beyond military conquest. The disruption of established trade networks had cascading effects throughout the region and beyond. Commercial relationships connecting Mesopotamia with the Indus Valley, Anatolia, and other distant regions were severed or significantly reduced. Local craft production declined as demand for luxury goods diminished and raw materials became scarce. Yet the administrative apparatus that emerged under Gutian rule represented not simple destruction, but a fundamental reimagining of how power could be organized. The highland approach to governance was about to challenge everything Mesopotamians believed about civilization. The administrative system emerging under Gutian rule represented a radical departure from the sophisticated bureaucratic hierarchies that had characterized Sumerian city-states and the Akkadian Empire. Rather than attempting to replicate complex structures they had conquered, the Gutians implemented a governance model reflecting their tribal origins while adapting to practical necessities of controlling sedentary populations. This hybrid system combined elements of traditional highland leadership with pragmatic accommodations to Mesopotamian administrative practices, creating something entirely new. Archaeological evidence from administrative centers reveals dramatic simplification of record-keeping systems. The vast cuneiform archives documenting every aspect of Akkadian administration gave way to much smaller tablet collections dealing primarily with tribute collection and resource distribution. At sites like Gesu and Umma, administrative quarters show clear modifications during this period, with many document storage rooms being converted to other purposes. The standardized cylinder seals facilitating Akkadian bureaucratic communication largely disappeared, replaced by simpler stamp seals reflecting highland traditions. The Gutian approach to local governance relied heavily on existing Mesopotamian administrative personnel, though under significantly altered circumstances. Rather than replacing local officials entirely, Gutian rulers typically retained experienced scribes, tax collectors, and other functionaries while placing them under supervision of Gutian overseers. This system preserved essential administrative knowledge while ensuring highland control over key decisions. Tablets from Pusrish Dagon, a major administrative center, contain references suggesting continuity of certain bureaucratic procedures from the Gutian period. But power was fragmenting. Territorial organization under Gutian rule reflected their decentralized political traditions rather than the unified imperial structure of their predecessors. Individual Gutian chieftains appear to have controlled specific regions or cities, maintaining loose, confederate relationships with other highland leaders rather than serving under a single, supreme authority. This fragmented approach created a patchwork of semi-autonomous territories, each with its own administrative practices and tribute obligations. Unity was more theoretical than actual. Evidence from contemporary tablets indicates that Gutian administrators focused primarily on extracting agricultural surpluses and controlling trade routes rather than maintaining the complex urban services characterizing earlier periods. The elaborate irrigation management systems sustaining Mesopotamian agriculture received minimal attention from authorities who lacked both technical expertise and institutional commitment necessary for their maintenance. This neglect had cascading effects on agricultural productivity throughout the region as canals silted up and distribution networks deteriorated. The relationship between Gutian rulers and Mesopotamian urban populations reveals a complex dynamic of accommodation and resistance. Unlike conquerors seeking to impose entirely foreign systems, the Gutians generally allowed local communities to maintain traditional social structures and daily practices while extracting tribute and asserting ultimate political authority. This approach minimized immediate resistance but also limited the depth of Gutian integration into Mesopotamian society. Local governance at the city level showed considerable variation, reflecting the decentralized nature of highland political organization. Among these leaders, some would stand out. Eridupizir stands as perhaps the most prominent Gutian ruler documented in contemporary sources, his name appearing on numerous tablets from sites across northern Mesopotamia. Administrative texts from Nineveh and Tel Brak indicate he controlled territories extending from the Diyala River Valley to the upper reaches of the Tigris, suggesting a degree of territorial consolidation unusual for Gutian political organization. His reign appears to have lasted approximately 7 years, during which he implemented administrative reforms attempting to systematize tribute collection while maintaining local governance structures. The tablets bearing Eridupizir's name reveal sophisticated understanding of Mesopotamian administrative practices, indicating either personal familiarity with lowland bureaucratic systems or reliance on experienced Mesopotamian advisors. Economic records from his reign show standardized measures and systematic record-keeping contrasting sharply with the ad hoc administrative practices typical of earlier Gutian rulers. Land tenure documents suggest he attempted to formalize property relationships in conquered territories, possibly to facilitate more efficient tribute extraction or to accommodate Gutian settlers seeking permanent agricultural holdings. Imtar, whose reign followed Eridupizir, represents a different approach to kingship that emphasized accommodation with existing Mesopotamian institutions rather than systematic reform. His name appears frequently in temple records from Nippur and Babylon, indicating active engagement with religious establishments that had maintained distance from earlier Gutian rulers. Economic tablets suggest Imtar reduced tribute demands on certain temple estates while requiring religious institutions to provide military support for his campaigns. But pressure was building from the south. Inkishush, documented in tablets from the later portion of the Gutian period, governed during a time of increasing pressure from resurgent Sumerian city-states in southern Mesopotamia. His reign coincided with early phases of the Ur III revival, requiring defensive strategies against increasingly sophisticated opposition forces. Administrative records show emergency mobilization measures and resource concentration, indicating the challenges facing Gutian authority. The territorial control he exercised appears concentrated in northern Mesopotamia, with southern territories increasingly contested by Sumerian forces. Sarlagab, among the final Gutian rulers documented in contemporary sources, governed during the terminal phase of highland dominance as Sumerian forces under Utu Hegal of Uruk mounted successful campaigns to expel Gutian forces from Mesopotamia. His reign provides crucial insights into the collapse of Gutian political authority and factors contributing to their eventual defeat. Administrative tablets from his brief rule show increasingly desperate attempts to maintain control over diminishing territories, with fragmentation of authority appearing in competing claims to kingship among different highland commanders. The succession patterns among Gutian rulers reveal political structures combining hereditary elements with elective or competitive selection processes characteristic of tribal societies. Evidence suggests leadership succession was contested rather than automatic, with different claimants requiring recognition from subordinate commanders and allied tribal groups. This system provided flexibility in leadership selection, but also created instability during succession crises that would prove fatal when facing coordinated Mesopotamian resistance. The seeds of rebellion were germinating. The religious syncretism emerging during the Gutian period created complex theological landscapes, combining Mesopotamian divine pantheons with highland spiritual traditions. The process of religious integration proceeded gradually and varied significantly among different regions, reflecting local conditions and attitudes of individual Gutian commanders toward traditional Mesopotamian religious practices. This wasn't forced conversion, but pragmatic accommodation that satisfied both conquered populations and highland rulers seeking legitimacy. Gutian rulers generally adopted formal relationships with major Mesopotamian deities while maintaining private devotion to highland spiritual traditions that remained largely invisible in official records. Royal inscriptions from this period show Gutian kings invoking traditional Mesopotamian gods like Enlil and Marduk in contexts suggesting genuine religious devotion rather than mere political expedience. However, archaeological evidence from residential areas associated with Gutian elites reveals continued use of highland religious artifacts and ritual practices not integrated into official religious observances. Temple administration during the Gutian period shows modifications reflecting both practical administrative needs and religious accommodation between different traditions. Gutian authorities generally maintained existing temple hierarchies while introducing highland religious personnel into lower-level positions within religious establishments. This integration created opportunities for cultural exchange while preserving specialized knowledge required for maintaining traditional Mesopotamian religious practices. But these same temples were becoming centers of resistance, quietly preserving knowledge and coordinating opposition that would eventually drive the Gutians from power. The religious syncretism that had emerged under Gutian rule contained within it the seeds of organized resistance as Mesopotamian temple complexes gradually transformed from centers of theological accommodation into focal points for coordinated opposition. The priestly hierarchies that had initially cooperated with Gutian administrators began exploiting their unique position within Mesopotamian society to preserve not only religious traditions but also the political and cultural frameworks that had sustained lowland civilization for millennia. Revolution was being planned in sacred spaces. The temple of Enlil at Nippur emerged as perhaps the most significant center of anti-Gutian sentiment during the middle decades of highland rule. Archaeological evidence from the sacred precinct reveals systematic concealment of valuable religious artifacts and administrative records, suggesting organized efforts to preserve Mesopotamian cultural heritage from potential Gutian interference. Cuneiform tablets discovered in hidden caches within the temple complex document correspondence between Nippur priests and religious authorities in other cities, creating networks of communication operating independently of Gutian administrative oversight. Preservation activities undertaken by Mesopotamian religious institutions extended far beyond simple protection of physical artifacts to encompass maintenance of intellectual traditions, forming the foundation of lowland civilization. Scribal schools attached to major temples continued operating throughout the Gutian period, though often in reduced circumstances and with modified curricula emphasizing preservation of existing knowledge rather than innovation. These educational institutions became repositories for Sumerian literary traditions, mathematical knowledge, and legal precedents that would prove crucial for eventual restoration of Mesopotamian political authority. One city was preparing for its moment. The city-state of Lagash under the leadership of Gudea represents the most successful example of sustained resistance to Gutian authority through a combination of diplomatic accommodation and covert opposition activities. Unlike rulers who chose direct military confrontation with highland forces, Gudea pursued a sophisticated strategy maintaining nominal submission to Gutian overlords while systematically strengthening Lagash's military capabilities and expanding its territorial influence throughout southern Mesopotamia. His genius lay in appearing weak while growing strong. Gudea's building projects, documented extensively in contemporary inscriptions and archaeological remains, served multiple purposes extending far beyond their apparent religious and civic functions. The construction of temples, palaces, and defensive works provided employment for displaced populations while creating infrastructure that could support military operations when circumstances permitted open resistance. The elaborate temple complex dedicated to Ningirsu required massive resource mobilization, demonstrating Lagash's economic vitality while training workers in construction techniques applicable to military engineering. The diplomatic correspondence preserved in Gudea's archives reveals sophisticated intelligence networks monitoring Gutian military movements and political developments throughout Mesopotamia. Lagash maintained trade relationships with regions beyond Gutian control, creating channels for obtaining military supplies and coordinating with other resistance centers. The commercial activities sustaining these relationships provided cover for political communications while generating resources essential for military preparations. Agricultural policies implemented by Gudea provided both economic foundation for resistance activities and practical training for potential military campaigns. But the true mastermind of liberation was rising in another city. The emergence of Utu-Hegal as a significant political force in southern Mesopotamia occurred against the backdrop of systematic Mesopotamian resistance that had gradually weakened Gutian control throughout the region. Archaeological evidence from Uruk during the early 22nd century BC reveals intensive military preparations and territorial consolidation that transformed the ancient city from a regional center into the launching point for the most successful anti-Gutian campaign in Mesopotamian history. Administrative tablets from this period document massive resource mobilization efforts drawing upon both Uruk's traditional economic base and the extensive network of allied communities developed during decades of highland occupation. Utu-Hegal's early political career demonstrates sophisticated understanding of both military strategy and diplomatic coordination, enabling him to succeed where previous resistance efforts had failed. Unlike earlier Mesopotamian leaders who focused primarily on defending individual territories, Utu-Hegal recognized that effective opposition to Gutian rule required coordinated action across multiple city-states and regions. His initial consolidation of power within Uruk involved systematic elimination of pro-Gutian elements, while simultaneously building alliances with other resistance centers throughout southern Mesopotamia. The military reforms implemented by Utu-Hegal during his rise to power reflected careful analysis of Gutian tactical methods and strategic vulnerabilities. Traditional Mesopotamian military organization had emphasized individual city-state armies operating independently and often competing with each other for territorial advantage. Utu-Hagal's innovations created unified command structures that could coordinate operations across extensive territories while maintaining flexibility necessary for effective campaign management. The final confrontation was approaching. Tirigan's position as the last major Gutian king placed him at the center of highland efforts to maintain political control over Mesopotamian territories increasingly contested by resurgent Sumerian forces. Archaeological evidence from sites under his control shows intensive military preparations and defensive construction projects, indicating clear recognition of the growing threat posed by Utu-Hagal's coalition. Administrative tablets from the final years of Gutian rule document emergency mobilization measures and resource concentration efforts, demonstrating the pressure facing highland authorities. The territorial extent of Tirigan's authority appears significantly reduced compared to earlier Gutian rulers, with effective control limited primarily to northern Mesopotamian regions where highland settlement had been most intensive. Southern territories that had been contested throughout the Gutian period increasingly fell under the influence of Mesopotamian resistance leaders, creating a fragmented political landscape, complicating defensive coordination. Archaeological surveys from this period show abandonment of many Gutian administrative centers in southern regions, suggesting strategic withdrawal rather than comprehensive territorial defense. The defensive preparations undertaken by Tirigan's forces reveal sophisticated understanding of Mesopotamian military capabilities and strategic objectives. Fortification projects from this period show innovative combinations of highland fortress design with lowland siege defense techniques, creating defensive installations specifically adapted to counter anticipated Sumerian tactical methods. Archaeological evidence from these fortifications indicates substantial investment in defensive preparations, though resources available for such projects were clearly limited by the reduced territorial base under Gutian control, but nothing could stop what was coming. The decisive campaign culminating in Tirigan's defeat around 2112 BC represented the culmination of decades of Mesopotamian resistance and military preparation combined with systematic exploitation of Gutian political and military vulnerabilities. Utu-Hagal's strategic approach emphasized rapid movement and concentrated attacks, preventing effective Gutian defensive coordination while maintaining pressure across multiple fronts simultaneously. Archaeological evidence from battlefield sites associated with this campaign shows clear tactical innovations maximizing Mesopotamian advantages while negating traditional highland military strengths. The opening phases of Utu-Hagal's campaign focused on isolating Gutian strongholds from mutual support while systematically reducing highland control over key transportation routes and communication networks. Mesopotamian forces employed coordinated attacks against multiple targets simultaneously, preventing Gutian commanders from concentrating forces for effective defensive operations. The speed and coordination of these initial operations demonstrates sophisticated logistical planning and tactical execution, reflecting months of detailed preparation and intelligence gathering that had mapped every Gutian weakness. The final confrontation between Utu-Hagal's forces and Tirigan's army occurred in circumstances maximizing Mesopotamian tactical advantages while limiting Gutian opportunities to employ their traditional military strengths. Contemporary sources indicate the decisive battle took place in terrain favoring coordinated formation, fighting over the individual combat skills and mobility that had traditionally given highland forces their edge. Tirigan's capture during the final battle marked the effective end of organized Gutian resistance and the collapse of highland political authority throughout Mesopotamia. The Gutian century had ended. The immediate aftermath of the Gutian defeat created complex challenges for Utu-Hagal's administration, as victorious Mesopotamian forces had to establish effective governance over territories that had experienced decades of political fragmentation and economic disruption. The restoration of traditional Mesopotamian administrative systems required reconstruction of bureaucratic institutions, legal frameworks, and economic relationships that had been modified or abandoned during the period of highland rule. Archaeological evidence from administrative centers shows intensive reconstruction activities during the immediate post-Gutian period. The treatment of surviving Gutian populations following their military defeat reveals Utu-Hegal's sophisticated approach to political consolidation, balancing demands for retribution with practical requirements for territorial integration. Rather than implementing wholesale expulsion or extermination policies, Mesopotamian authorities generally allowed Gutian communities to remain in territories where they had established permanent settlements, while requiring political submission and cultural accommodation to restored Mesopotamian authority. This approach minimized ongoing resistance while preserving valuable population and economic resources. Economic recovery following the Gutian defeat required systematic reconstruction of commercial networks, agricultural systems, and craft production facilities that had been disrupted during decades of political instability. Utu-Hegal's administration implemented policies encouraging restoration of traditional economic activities while incorporating beneficial innovations that had emerged during the period of highland rule. Archaeological evidence from commercial centers shows rapid resumption of long-distance trade relationships and restoration of specialized craft production that had declined during the Gutian period. But how would history remember these mountain warriors? The expulsion of Tirigan and collapse of Gutian political authority created an immediate need for Mesopotamian scribes and administrators to construct historical narratives that would explain the century-long period of highland dominance while legitimizing the restored Sumerian political order. The literary traditions emerging during the Ur III period established interpretive frameworks that fundamentally shaped how later civilizations understood the Gutian period, often prioritizing ideological messaging over accurate historical documentation. History, as always, was written by the victors. The Sumerian king list compiled during the reign of Utu-Hegal's successors presents the most influential early interpretation of Gutian rule through its characterization of the highland period as an illegitimate interruption of divinely sanctioned Mesopotamian kingship. The text's famous description of the Gutians as the fanged serpent of the mountains, who carried off the kingship to the mountains, established a literary template portraying highland rulers as fundamentally foreign and destructive to proper civilizational order. This characterization served multiple ideological purposes for restored Mesopotamian authorities. Contemporary administrative documents from the Ur III period reveal systematic efforts to erase or reinterpret physical evidence of Gutian governmental achievements that might have challenged the narrative of highland incompetence and destructiveness. Building inscriptions from this period often claim credit for construction projects that archaeological evidence suggests were actually completed during the Gutian period, while modifications to existing structures removed or obscured architectural elements reflecting highland design influences. These editorial activities demonstrate conscious historical revisionism designed to support preferred interpretations of recent events. But what was the truth? The systematic expulsion of Gutian forces from Mesopotamian territories following Tirigan's defeat initiated a complex process of highland retreat unfolding over several decades rather than occurring as a single, coordinated withdrawal. Archaeological evidence from sites along traditional migration routes connecting Mesopotamia with the central Zagros mountains reveals a pattern of gradual abandonment of lowland settlements, accompanied by establishment of new highland communities incorporating both traditional Gutian cultural elements and administrative innovations acquired during their century of territorial rule. The re-establishment of Gutian communities in their ancestral mountain territories required significant adaptations to accommodate populations that had spent generations in Mesopotamian environments and had developed hybrid cultural practices combining highland traditions with lowland administrative and technological knowledge. Excavations at sites such as Godin Tepe show clear evidence of architectural modifications during the late 3rd millennium BC, reflecting integration of Mesopotamian building techniques with traditional highland fortress designs, creating defensive installations more sophisticated than earlier mountain strongholds. Material culture assemblages from highland sites dating to the immediate post-expulsion period demonstrate the persistence of cultural innovations that had emerged during the period of lowland occupation. Pottery traditions show continued production of hybrid ceramic forms, combining traditional Zagros, grey-black burnished wares with vessel shapes, and decorative motifs derived from Mesopotamian prototypes. Metallurgical evidence indicates adoption of bronzed working techniques and tool designs acquired through contact with lowland craft specialists, creating technological capabilities, enhancing highland economic productivity and military effectiveness. They had learned much from their century in Mesopotamia. The social organization of re-established Gutian communities reveals fundamental changes from pre-conquest tribal structures, reflecting both demographic mixing that had occurred during the Mesopotamian period and administrative experience gained through territorial governance. Traditional kinship-based leadership systems were modified to incorporate hierarchical administrative positions that had proven effective during highland rule over sedentary populations. Archaeological evidence from residential areas shows greater social stratification than had characterized earlier highland communities, with elite compounds displaying architectural features and material culture assemblages reflecting accumulated wealth and administrative authority. Agricultural practices in highland territories underwent significant modifications as returning Gutian populations attempted to apply irrigation techniques and crop management strategies observed during their occupation of Mesopotamian territories. Terrace field systems constructed during this period show sophisticated engineering combining traditional highland water management with lowland hydraulic principles, creating agricultural infrastructure supporting larger populations than had been sustainable under purely traditional subsistence strategies. The introduction of new crop varieties, particularly improved barley strains developed in Mesopotamian agricultural centers, enhanced food security. The integration of pastoral and agricultural activities within highland communities created economic systems that were more diversified and resilient than either pure nomadism or intensive cultivation. Archaeological evidence from storage facilities shows systematic management of both grain surpluses and livestock products, indicating planned economic strategies maximizing resource utilization while maintaining flexibility for seasonal migration and environmental adaptation. The Gutians had not simply returned home, they had returned transformed. Political reorganization within highland territories proceeded through gradual consolidation of traditional tribal authorities under leaders who had gained administrative experience during the Mesopotamian occupation. Rather than returning to purely traditional governance structures, Gutian communities developed political systems incorporating bureaucratic elements alongside kinship-based authority relationships. Administrative tablets from highland sites, though less numerous than Mesopotamian archives, document systematic record-keeping and resource management, demonstrating continued application of governmental techniques acquired through territorial administration. Military organization within highland communities retained many innovations developed during the Mesopotamian campaigns, while adapting these techniques to traditional mountain warfare requirements. Weapons assemblages from this period show continued production of bronze implements using techniques acquired through contact with lowland metalworkers, while fortification systems incorporated defensive principles learned through siege warfare experience. The combination of traditional highland mobility with improved weapons technology and tactical knowledge created military capabilities superior to pre-conquest highland forces. The persistence of Gutian political identity following their expulsion from Mesopotamia appears in various forms of cultural expression, maintaining connections to the period of territorial rule while adapting to changed circumstances. Artistic traditions documented in archaeological assemblages show continued production of objects bearing iconographic elements associated with highland authority during the Mesopotamian period. These cultural markers served to maintain group identity and political legitimacy while providing tangible connections to achievements of the conquest period. But their story was far from over. The economic relationships developing between highland Gutian communities and Mesopotamian city-states during the Ur III period reveal pragmatic accommodation on both sides, transcending the military hostilities of the conquest and expulsion periods. Administrative tablets from Mesopotamian archives document trade relationships involving highland products such as metals, livestock, and forest materials in exchange for manufactured goods and agricultural surpluses. These commercial interactions provided economic benefits for both highland and lowland communities, while creating diplomatic channels, reducing the likelihood of renewed military conflict. Ur III administrative records reveal sophisticated diplomatic protocols governing interactions with highland Gutian communities, recognizing their political autonomy while establishing frameworks for peaceful coexistence. Treaties documented in cuneiform archives established territorial boundaries, trade regulations, and dispute resolution mechanisms, enabling stable relationships despite recent history of military conflict. These diplomatic arrangements demonstrate mutual recognition of legitimate interests and practical benefits from peaceful interaction rather than continued hostility. The gradual integration of highland territories into broader regional political systems accelerated during the Old Babylonian period as Mesopotamian political fragmentation created opportunities for highland communities to establish advantageous relationships with competing lowland powers. Administrative documents from various Mesopotamian archives document highland military service in lowland armies, diplomatic marriages between highland and lowland elite families, and commercial partnerships creating cross-cutting loyalties and interests. These relationships facilitated highland political development while providing lowland rulers access to highland military expertise and economic resources. The Gutians were becoming part of the region's fabric. The Middle Assyrian period witnessed significant changes in highland-lowland relationships as Assyrian territorial expansion brought highland communities under more direct imperial administration while recognizing their military value and strategic importance. Assyrian royal inscriptions document highland military units serving in imperial armies and highland nobles holding administrative positions within the imperial bureaucracy. These developments indicate successful integration of highland populations into Assyrian political systems while maintaining their distinctive cultural characteristics and specialized military capabilities. Highland military service in Assyrian armies provided opportunities for cultural exchange and technological transfer, enhancing highland capabilities while contributing to Assyrian military effectiveness. Archaeological evidence from highland sites during this period shows adoption of Assyrian military technologies and tactical innovations alongside continued development of traditional highland warfare techniques. The combination of imperial military training with indigenous tactical knowledge created highland military capabilities valued throughout the ancient Near East. The Persian period marked the culmination of highland political integration as the Achaemenid Empire created administrative systems effectively incorporating highland territories while recognizing their strategic importance and cultural distinctiveness. Persian administrative documents from Persepolis include references to highland administrative units and military contingents demonstrating systematic integration into imperial governmental structures. Archaeological evidence from highland sites shows continued prosperity and cultural development under Persian administration, indicating successful accommodation between imperial requirements and highland interests. Their journey through history continued. The cultural continuity documented in highland archaeological sites throughout the 2nd and 1st millennia BC demonstrates the persistence of distinctive Gutian cultural traditions, despite political integration into various imperial systems. Pottery traditions, architectural styles, and religious practices show evolutionary development, maintaining fundamental highland characteristics while incorporating influences from contact with various political and cultural systems. This cultural persistence indicates successful adaptation strategies enabling highland communities to maintain their identity while participating effectively in broader regional political and economic systems. Linguistic evidence from highland regions during later periods suggests continued use of languages related to the original Gutian tongue, alongside adoption of various imperial languages for administrative and commercial purposes. Personal names preserved in administrative documents show persistence of traditional highland naming patterns, while demonstrating familiarity with Mesopotamian, Persian, and other regional linguistic traditions. This linguistic diversity indicates cultural sophistication, enabling effective participation in multilingual imperial systems while maintaining traditional cultural markers. Settlement patterns throughout highland regions during later periods show continued population growth and territorial expansion, building upon demographic and political foundations established during the original Mesopotamian occupation. Archaeological surveys document establishment of new settlements and expansion of existing communities throughout previously marginal highland territories. This territorial expansion indicates successful adaptation to changing political and economic conditions while maintaining cultural and political distinctiveness characterizing highland communities since their return from Mesopotamian territories. But how should modern scholars understand these ancient mountain warriors? The reassessment of Gutian contributions to Mesopotamian civilization has undergone dramatic transformation, as archaeological evidence has systematically challenged traditional literary portrayals of highland rule as purely destructive and culturally barren. Contemporary scholarly analysis reveals that the Gutian period, rather than representing a complete break with Mesopotamian administrative traditions, actually fostered significant innovations in governmental organization that would influence subsequent political developments throughout the ancient Near East. The truth was far more complex than ancient propaganda suggested. Administrative systems emerging during highland rule combined traditional Mesopotamian bureaucratic expertise with highland organizational principles, emphasizing flexibility and adaptation to local conditions, creating hybrid governmental structures proving remarkably resilient and effective. Administrative tablets from sites such as Nippur and Pusrish Dagon demonstrate that Gutian rulers implemented systematic record-keeping procedures, maintaining essential governmental functions while introducing innovations in resource management and territorial administration. The tribute collection systems developed during this period established standardized assessment procedures and regular collection schedules, providing more predictable revenue streams. Cultural exchange during the Gutian period facilitated technological and artistic innovations, enriching Mesopotamian civilization while introducing highland cultural elements, enhancing the diversity and adaptability of lowland society. Metallurgical techniques developed through highland collaboration produced superior bronze alloys and improved weapon designs, enhancing Mesopotamian military capabilities. Architectural innovations combining highland fortress design principles with lowland construction techniques created defensive installations more effective against siege warfare than traditional Mesopotamian fortifications. These technological advances demonstrate the creative potential of cultural interaction. The Gutian legacy endures. Modern archaeological discoveries have fundamentally altered scholarly understanding of Gutian society and governance through systematic excavation of highland sites and careful analysis of material culture assemblages, revealing the complexity and sophistication of highland political organization. Excavations at Godin Tepe have uncovered administrative complexes demonstrating systematic governmental organization and sophisticated record-keeping capabilities, contradicting traditional assumptions about nomadic political simplicity. Storage facilities and workshop areas show evidence of coordinated resource management and specialized craft production, indicating economic complexity comparable to contemporary Mesopotamian city-states. Fortification systems discovered at highland sites reveal military engineering capabilities, combining traditional mountain fortress design with innovations derived from contact with Mesopotamian siege warfare techniques. The defensive installations at sites such as Tepe Nush Ijan show sophisticated understanding of terrain utilization and coordinated defensive planning, enabling effective resistance to superior enemy forces. These archaeological discoveries demonstrate that highland military capabilities extended beyond individual combat effectiveness to include systematic defensive planning and coordinated tactical operations requiring substantial organizational sophistication. Settlement pattern analysis throughout the central Zagros Mountains has revealed complex demographic and political relationships among highland communities, supporting the large-scale military operations required for Mesopotamian conquest and occupation. Archaeological surveys have documented hierarchical settlement systems with major centers serving administrative and military coordination functions for extensive territories encompassing multiple tribal domains. These settlement patterns indicate political organization transcending traditional tribal boundaries while maintaining sufficient flexibility to accommodate seasonal migration and environmental adaptation requirements. Their story teaches us something profound. The Gutian experience provides insights into the processes through which nomadic societies adapted to the requirements of governing sedentary populations while maintaining their cultural identity and traditional social organization. The administrative innovations emerging during highland rule of Mesopotamia demonstrate creative solutions to practical challenges of territorial governance, drawing upon both nomadic organizational principles and sedentary administrative techniques. These hybrid governmental systems created precedents for multi-ethnic political organization, influencing subsequent developments throughout the ancient Near East. Military innovations emerging during the Gutian period reflect successful adaptation of highland warfare techniques to lowland strategic requirements while maintaining the tactical advantages enabling initial conquest success. The integration of highland mobility and individual combat skills with Mesopotamian siege capabilities and logistical organization created military systems superior to either tradition alone. These military developments demonstrate the potential for technological and tactical innovation resulting from cultural contact between different military traditions. The scholarly consensus emerging from decades of archaeological research and textual analysis emphasizes the complexity of the Gutian period and the limitations of traditional historical interpretations relying primarily on ideologically motivated literary sources. Contemporary understanding recognizes the Gutian century as a period of significant cultural interaction and institutional innovation rather than simple destruction and cultural regression. This revised interpretation has important implications for broader questions about the relationship between nomadic and sedentary societies, the dynamics of cultural change, and the processes through which political authority was established and maintained in the ancient world. What can we learn from their story? The Gutian legacy in Mesopotamian civilization extends far beyond the immediate political and military events of their century-long rule to encompass lasting contributions to governmental organization, military technology, and cultural expression that influence subsequent developments throughout the ancient Near East. The administrative systems, architectural innovations, and artistic traditions emerging during highland rule provided precedents and technical knowledge, enhancing the capabilities of later Mesopotamian dynasties, while demonstrating the benefits of cultural accommodation and institutional adaptation in multi-ethnic political systems. Modern understanding of the Gutian period continues to evolve as new archaeological discoveries provide additional evidence for the complexity and significance of highland contributions to Mesopotamian civilization. The systematic reassessment of traditional historical narratives has revealed the extent to which ideological considerations shaped ancient historical memory while obscuring actual achievements and innovations occurring during periods of foreign rule. This ongoing scholarly revision demonstrates the importance of combining multiple types of evidence in reconstructing ancient historical processes while remaining aware of how contemporary concerns and assumptions can influence historical interpretation. The story of the Gutians ultimately illustrates the dynamic nature of ancient civilizations and their capacity for adaptation, innovation, and cultural synthesis in response to changing political and environmental conditions. Their century of rule over Mesopotamia, far from representing a dark age of cultural stagnation, emerges as a period of significant institutional development and cultural creativity that contributed to the ongoing evolution of one of humanity's earliest and most influential civilizations. The highland peoples who descended from the Zagros mountains not only conquered and governed Mesopotamian territories, but also participated in the continuous process of cultural development that made ancient Mesopotamia a crucible of human innovation and achievement. If this epic journey through Gutian history captivated you, subscribe to Flow of History for more incredible stories of the forgotten peoples who shaped our ancient world.